Hello and welcome. My name is James from the DSO Imager channel. Today I'm going to do a comparison between SCTs and refractors, specifically my Celestron Edge HD8 and the Astronomics AT115 EDT. What you see here are both of my scopes. Please ignore the rat nest of cables. These are older pictures and neither one of these rigs look like this now. I've got everything very tidy. And I basically just have two cables coming off of each of the scopes, a single power cable, and on the SCT I'm still using that laptop, so I got a USB cable coming off of it. But on the AT115 I'm running a mini PC on there, so really the only thing coming off of that one is a single power cable and the USB cable that connects to the mount head. Alright, so to get started, why am I doing this comparison? And is this really an apples to apples comparison? It's a question that comes up a lot of times in social media, on Facebook, on internet forums. And so I kind of wanted to go over a lot of this. So now with these two particular scopes, they actually have similar costs. In fact, I purchased the 8-inch SCT back in mid to late 2019, and I want to say it was like $13.99, so right at $1,400. And a couple years later, I picked up the AT115 EDT for the same price. It was I want to say $13.99, $1,400. Both could be the next logical step. So the scenario here is that you have someone that has maybe started astrophotography and they followed the recommended steps, which is usually to get a small refractor, right? And this was the case with myself. I was running a 70mm refractor at the time. And I wanted to move on to something that was more than wide field. I wanted to get a closer look. And both of these scopes have longer focal length. And you see these scopes are scopes very similar mentioned when reading in forums or looking elsewhere where people are thinking about upgrading to or adding a new scope to their collection. And so this comparison really does apply to a whole family of stuff, right? So on the SCT stuff, you got the 8-inch, you got 9 1/4, 10-inch, 11-inch. You have on the Celestron side the Edge version and the non-Edge version. Main difference is the Edge version gives you a flat field. You don't need a flattener or anything like that for it. On the also you have Meade SCTs, and I think there's some other similar scopes out there for SCTs, and often a lot of people, when they've decided that they want something in the size focal range of one of these SCTs, they're also looking at RC scopes and other styles of reflective type scopes. And on the refractor side, you know, the AT115 EDT is very similar to a lot of other 115mm refractors out there. Some are by TS Optics, Orion. A whole bunch of companies have variations of this 115mm refractor. And I'd even argue that this is kind of representative of refractors down to about 100mm and refractors up to about 120mm. I mean, they're all kind of in the same boat. Cost vary wildly. This 115 EDT is definitely on the less expensive end. But if you get a 120mm refractor with FPL 53 glass in there, you're going to spend a pretty penny on that. Both scopes weigh about the same. Both scopes have the same mount requirements in the sense that you need. I mean, I'm running them on EQ6s. I have two of those, and I really would consider an Atlas class mount about the starting point for either one of these. I think you can get away with a smaller mount. I know people do. I've seen some people run both of these scopes on AVXs, HEQ5. I think that may be pushing the limits, especially for the Edge, but we'll get into that in a little bit later. But anyway, you know, those types of mounts are pretty much the same. So this video is not really going to talk too much about mount requirements. I'll mention it a little bit, but we're both basically focused on the performance of the two scopes in a deep sky astrophotography context. And lastly, I actually have experience with both of these. I run both of these rigs every clear night at the same time. I've got, like I mentioned, two EQ6Rs, so I'm not having to pick one or the other on a clear night. And I feel I've gotten a good feeling for how to use both of these telescopes. Now, obviously, the focal lengths are very different on these scopes, so they're really intended for different targets, or what I have here, or different types of targets, right? The SCT is definitely going to be a better option if you're looking for galaxies, and the refractor is the better option if you're wanting to go for larger nebula, emission nebula type targets. 115 is definitely a more forgiving scope. It handles the wind better, and you don't need as precise guiding thanks to the larger image scale. There have been nights where I've had both rigs ready to run, and it was too windy for the edge. I have found that anything over about 7-8 mile an hour, or if there's frequent gusts, especially if the wind's inconsistent coming from different directions, the mount has a really difficult time guiding that scope effectively, and any data that I'm getting that night is usually garbage. So yeah, there have been nights where the 115 is just chugging away, it's not having any issues, it's dealing with the wind just fine, and the edge I end up putting the cover on and take the time to get new darks. Now, I believe you can get better performance guiding running an off-axis guider. That said, I am using a guide scope on the 115, and guiding is just fine with the 115. On the edge, because you need better guiding that take advantage of the lower image scale that that scope gives you, you really want an off-axis guider. I know some people have had some success using guide scopes. If you're using like an 80 millimeter refractor, something with a focal length of 400 millimeters or more, you can probably get really good results using that guide scope. But there's another consideration, and that is that the mirror on the back of the edge does float, and it can shift through the night as the mount is tracking across the sky. And if you're using a guide scope and that mirror shifts, then you've just introduced flexure, which is going to give you elongated stars across your whole frame, all pointing in the same direction. With an off-axis guider, your guiding shifts with the mirror, so it pretty much mitigates the problems that you may encounter when that mirror shifts. Now, it's not a major thing, it doesn't happen frequently, and quite frankly, I haven't really noticed any mirror shift issues with any of my subs, but that could be because I'm running the off-axis guider on there. Of course, off-axis guiders have their own set of challenges. For one, you really want parfocal filters, and that would be filters, from the same manufacturer, the same set, that you would be fine. The reason why this is an issue is that if you mix filters of different thickness, the thickness actually changes your focal distance, and so that means your focus point is different. Now, in a refractor, that's no big deal if you're using a guide scope, but if the filter wheel is behind the off-axis guider, then as you're changing focus to bring these different thickness filters in frame, you may be taking the guide stars in and out of focus. And in fact, this is what I ran into, because when I moved over from the 70 millimeter refractor, I had a mix of branded filters. I was running, at the time, ZWO LRGB filters. I had an Astronomic S2 and O3 filter, and I had an Astrodon HA filter. That Astrodon filter is 3 millimeters thick versus the 2 millimeter thickness on the other filters. And anytime I focused the HA, it took the guide stars of the OAG out of focus, and then I couldn't guide. So I had to get a Astronomic HA filter to use with that setup. It was either that or change the whole thing to Astrodon, and well, if anyone's familiar with the cost of Astrodon, or if you can even find them these days, that wasn't a good option. That was before Chroma was around too. And of course, the other issue is finding suitable guide stars. It can be a challenge, and I've had some trouble with my Edge. Now, the thing is, you're using that OAG, so the main scope, that 8-inch SCT, is also your guide scope. So your field of view is already very narrow. And in my case, my OAG has a very small prism. So it's even a smaller field of view that I'm trying to find stars. And there are areas out there, especially in galaxy season, where if your scope's pointed away from the Milky Way, you can run into situations where you can not find a suitable guide star. If you're running an off-axis guider on the refractor, and the refractor has a much shorter focal length, then chances are you're still going to be able to find a guide star. And of course, if you're running a guide scope, you're definitely not going to run into any problems with guide stars. Now, one way around the issue of not being able to find a guide star is that you can rotate the imaging train, and a lot of off-axis guiders accommodate this, including the ZWO. It's got these three little screws that you can loosen up, and you can rotate it, clockwise or counterclockwise a little bit. But where that causes issues for me is that I'm often shooting the same target night after night after night, and frequently I'm shooting multiple targets as a night. As one target sets, I'll switch to the next target that's rising. And so I need my my field of view to the rotation to not change. So it's just not practical to go out there and manually adjust the camera angle across different targets on the same night. So the end result for me is that there have been some targets that I've had to just pass on because I can't get a good guide star, and hopefully one day I'll have a setup that I can go back to those targets. Now, my Edge 8 definitely takes longer to cool than the refractor. Typically, I'd say it takes about an hour, and that's if I'm bringing it out and putting it on the mount the evening that I'm going to start imaging. It takes about an hour to cool down. So that first hour of imaging is usually not good stars. Guiding is terrible because, of course, of the off-axis guider. But then once things adjust, it does all right. I've never had any problems with my 115. Now, maybe a larger refractor, I've heard they take longer to cool down. But at the 115 size, it hasn't been too much of a problem. And yes, the Edge is, or the SCT is definitely more sensitive to seeing conditions. So if you've got a night with poor seeing conditions, I've still been able to run the 115 where the SCT just can't. And the way the problems of poor seeing manifest itself is, one, the guiding, of course, is not doing well at all. But the other problem is that it's very hard for the autofocus routines to run when seeing is really bad. So if the seeing is super bad and I'm having trouble getting the focus to work, it's kind of like when it's windy out. I'll have to stop imaging with the SCT and just let the refractor run. And this is one that I see come up in forums. I've been asked about this a few times. SCTs seem to have a reputation for having bloated stars. But you'll see. We'll jump into PixInsight and we'll take a close look at some of the images, and that should answer the question of whether or not SCTs have bloated stars. Now, before we jump into PixInsight and take a look at the pictures, I just wanted to list out how the two rigs are set up. So you can see that they're both on EQ6R Pros. I have two of them. It's not completely apples to apples because I'm running a 294 mono on the Edge and a 1600 mono on the AT115. We have astronomic filters on the Edge. The AT115 has a mix of chroma and Astrodon. Both are running reducers. Now, one could say that, well, you just use a flattener with the 115 to get the longer focal length, and that brings it closer perhaps to focal length and performance of the SCT, because then they would both be operating at f7. But I mean, you can take away the reducer on the SCT as well and take a full advantage. You don't even need a flattener with the edge, because all edge scopes will present the flat field. So I mean, I'm running them both with reducers. I think most folks will be running these with reducers, and so this is the comparison here, how they're configured. Like I mentioned before, I got the ZWO off-axis guider on the edge. It's a small one with the 8mm prism. If I had done things differently, I would have gotten a OAG with a larger prism. We're running a 50mm guide scope on the 115. Both are using their stock focusers. I'm using that Celestron focus motor on the edge and a ZWO EAF on the 115. And just as far as specs go, like I said, I'm using the reducers. So with my edge, I'm at 1422mm versus 644mm. So I mean, you know, that 115 is a fairly wide field scope. I still consider this wide field. I mean, it's not, you know, Red Cat 51 wide field, but I still consider it a wide field scope. Let's see, Dawes limit. I'm not going to go into any of the math or science behind how telescopes work. I just want to throw this out here. It's basically the resolving power, one of the ways that you can define the resolving power of the telescope. And so obviously the edge is a bigger scope and it's going to have more resolving capability, and we're going to see that in the pictures. There's our image scale. So the image scale of the edge is 0.67 arc seconds, while the image scale of the 115 is 1.22 arc seconds. Now I should mention I'm using that 294, but I'm using the native bin 2 mode, so it's like the 4.6 micron pixels. The image scale would be, if I remember correctly, I did run for a short time the ASI 1600 on this edge, and I believe the image scale was around 0.55. And I also have the field of view. So obviously you get a much wider field of view with the 115 versus the edge. So these two scopes, they're comparative as far as price and weight and for consideration as a next step from a wide field refractor. But the type of targets that you're going to image with them is definitely going to be different. Alright, so let's jump into PixInsight. I have taken a number of targets, the same targets with both scopes. So I think this is going to offer a good comparison here. Alright, so let's first look at a galaxy shot. So here we go with NGC 4725. So this is the shot with the 18115, and here it is with the Celestron Edge. So obviously much tighter field of view, and but we're seeing more. You can see that I couldn't. There's three galaxies, right? You got this little spiral galaxy up here. You have this one with its tidal stream, and I couldn't quite fit all three in. In fact, I couldn't even get most of the tidal stream off of this guy in here. So that's why I actually revisited this target this year with the 18115, because I wanted to get all of this in there. Now if we take a closer look at the galaxy itself, and the angles are not the same here, but it's pretty clear. I think the 115 is actually doing okay here. This is drizzled, by the way. The 115 is drizzled. The edge is not drizzled. So I mean, it's not bad. The edge is obviously much better. So if the galaxy itself was the focus of the target, that's what I would be the choice between these two scopes. Also note the stars. They don't look too bloated on that edge shot, do they? I mean, this is a final processed image, and today we've got a lot of tools for star reduction, blur exterminator, star removal options. So I mean, even if the stars are bloated, you have a way of controlling that. But just to kind of show the point, This is a single frame from each. And I mean, yeah, I mean the stars are larger, right? Because we have a smaller image scale, and so the star is coming across more pixels. But if we were to zoom into the same image scale, the stars are not looking too different. Now, I mean, this isn't a total apples to apples. Not only is the image scale different, right, but this 115 is 120-second exposure, and on the edge I was doing 180-second exposures. Alright, now my last video I actually covered the process of shooting the Crescent Nebula with my 115. This is an HA frame, and we're getting the field of view here, and a couple years ago I shot the Crescent with the edge. Now, obviously, a tighter fit here. The reason why I wanted to go after this with the 115 and this wider field of view is I wanted to grab that elusive soap bubble. And you can barely see it in here. There it is. But, of course, I was not going to be able to fit that in a single frame with the edge. If we take a closer look, at the nebula itself, we can kind of get an idea, and I think, honestly, I think in this one the 115 held up pretty well. Now, again, this is drizzled on the 115 side, not drizzled on the edge side. And they look pretty good here. These are totally unprocessed HA stacks. 13 hours on the edge. Oh, I don't remember how much it was on this one, but I think it was a little bit more, if I'm remembering correctly. Right, it was 30 hours. I think it was like 17 hours on this. So this is actually a few more hours more than what we've got on the edge here. All right, and of course, narrowband stars are always tight, right? So you're not seeing any bloated stars on either of these. Now let's take a look. This is the final image of the with the 115, and here's the final image with the edge. Now don't pay so much attention to the colors, right? Because it's different processing, and even I can't produce the exact same image with the same data 2 or 3 times in a row. Every image I process is a individual. So you can see here, like, the color choices on the O3 shell are different, and I emphasize the shell more, the O3 more on the edge shot, but I emphasize the HA more on the wider field shot. But anyway, I'd say these look pretty good here. Dare I say the 115 looks a little bit sharper. Now, I really pushed the data on the 115. And that's why it looks pretty good. But if we zoom in, it starts to break down. See, we can go in closer on the edge, and it's still holding together. In fact, I would argue that I could probably push the edge further. And so that is actually one of the advantages of going at longer focal lengths with a smaller image scale, maybe being on the edge of oversampled, because you can push the data further, and I'll demonstrate that right now. So we're both zoomed in. I mean, already you can see the data has been overcooked. To me, this is what overcooked looks like, but we're really going to cook it now. So let's just make a preview box on both of these. Okay. And we're just going to run unsharp mask against these. And I'm just going to use the same setting for now. Alright, in fact, this almost looks like it did nothing. It sharpened it up a little bit more, but I could push this more. Why don't we do that? Why don't we just see how crazy it can get here? Oops. Yeah, now it's starting to break down. Yeah, that's definitely, in my book, that's too much. So let's bring it back down. You know, let's just go to the, where I think I had it, around 0.6. All right, now let's do the same to this already overcooked data here from the 115. Yeah, I mean, you know, it'll probably look pretty decent zoomed out, but once you scrutinize it a bit, it definitely does not. This looks artificial to me. So the longer focal length and the smaller image scale of the SCT does allow you to push that data more. Now, of course, that's not the point, though, of the refractor here, because the SCT, we want that close-up look, but the refractor, our goal is to get this object with more room around it and maybe grab something else that's nearby. Now, I want to show one more thing in the comparison here. Let me delete that preview box. This shot here is the refractor image registered to the SCT image. So we've basically changed the image scale of the refractor data to match the SCT. And the reason I did this is I wanted to compare the stars, right? I mean, we already know that the details in the nebula are kind of falling apart here on the refractor when zoomed in this close. But let's take a look at the stars. And again, this is basically to address the concerns of star bloat. Star bloat on an SCT. There we go. So how do these stars look? We're even seeing more stars on the SCT, which is interesting. The SCT, we have fewer hours, is about 24 hours of total exposure versus 30 hours on the refractor, and yet we can see more stars and more detail in the nebula than we can in a refractor. And that's also with the SCT at f7 versus f5.6 on the refractor. So that's just the light gathering advantage of the SCT, I believe, is what we're seeing there. Because same night sky, same mount, same quality tracking, everything else is the same. Alright, now in the interest of not letting this video get too long, let's just do a couple other quick comparisons. There's a shot of M101 with the 115. This is with the edge. Again, the field of view gives us more options for framing, but if our focus is the galaxy itself, then the SCT is a clear winner. No surprises. And how about everyone's favorite M42, right? So SCT on the left, 115 on the right. These are red subs because I didn't take any luminance when I shot M42 with the SCT. And here's a close-up, or here's the final image, right? So again, we get Running Man, we get more dust, more options here, but if we zoom in, and I really did not do a good job with the core on this 115, so we won't use the core as an example, but we can take a look over here. And I think this really is going to show the difference here. Yeah. So huge difference, way more potential. And again, this 115 data has more data in it. I don't remember. I want to say that the Celestron image, it was just like 3 hours, if that, of just straight RGB data. On this 115, I used HDR, and yeah, it took a lot more data with it. Now this may look like I'm favoring the SCT, but remember, it's at different purposes, right? I mean, here we got a single galaxy from the SCT on the left, and here we got a wide field shot of many galaxies and a rich star field on the right. I mean, you can't do this with an SCT. So if you want to do a wider shot, it's all about using the right tool for the job. I mean, yeah, maybe you can do mosaics, and that was my answer a couple years ago, is to just do mosaics, but you know, mosaics are difficult in the sense that you're time limited, and it's not just the weather that you're going to need more time, and you hope the weather cooperates. It's also the moon cycles, because if you're doing a mosaic, it's very important that your frames have the same level of gradient, especially if you're doing this in the backyard or whatever. It has the same level of gradient. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time getting the frames to match. So really, if you want a wider field, rather than doing a mosaic, you should just use the right optic for the job. Right? I mean, you can't do the Leo triplet with the edge unless you do a mosaic. I can barely squeeze in 2 of these galaxies with the edge in a single frame, and I would have to do maybe another frame, and I don't know if I'd get it all in. I definitely wouldn't get this tidal stream in here, and the framing wouldn't look great either, because it'll be squeezed in too much, and it just, I don't think, would be a great composition. I would have to take like 3 or 4 frames, panels of a mosaic to get the right framing with the SCT, and then you do your mosaic, and are you going to look at it like this? No, I mean, you're going to look at the whole picture zoomed out anyway, and so the extra resolving power of that SCD is almost going to waste. I mean, unless you're designing the picture to be zoomed in. I think this 115 actually held up pretty well zoomed in there. And yeah, here again, this is what you use your SCT for, to get a nice shot here, right? And I mean, so for folks in the northern hemisphere, if you've been running a small refractor, galaxy season can be painful. That just is a fact. You know, you see all these galaxy shots, and you know, your galaxy shots look like this. So if you want to scrutinize these galaxies a little bit, you need the SCT. And just one more example showing the benefits of both. Right, so with SCT, I went after Pickering's triangle, but if I want something like the Witch's Broom, right, what is this, Western Vale? Yeah, the SCT can't do it. Maybe if I had a full frame, but getting the full frame to work on an 8-inch SCT is a challenge. Now maybe the 9 1/4 with a full frame image can get most of this particular object, but in general, a refractor is what you're going to want to use for something like this. Alright, now I did not mention Newtonians, and I didn't include Newtonians because I don't have extensive experience with them. Speed-wise, they're faster than both of these scopes. This is, of course, discounting Hyperstar with an SCT, but then it's not really, it's a different type of optic. But Newtonians tend to be faster. Their focal lengths tend to be very similar to the refractors. They also tend to be a lot less expensive. But my understanding is there's also a good bit more tinkering going on with the newts. So those are things to consider, but I can't really speak for the newts in this context. So if you're considering your next scope and you're not sure if you want to go with a 115 millimeter, 120 millimeter refractor or something like that, or you're looking at an SCT like an 8-inch or a 10-inch or maybe an RC, although I can't speak for any experience with RCs. I understand that those have can be a challenge with collimating. But anyway, you consider the targets that you want to go after. If you really want to be able to hammer those galaxies on galaxy season, then I think the SCT is going to be the better option than a 4 or 5-inch refractor. That said, you really should consider your environment before jumping on something like an SCT. If the seeing conditions in your environment are not good, or if it's very windy, the SCT may prove to be an exercise in frustration. It's kind of difficult really to gauge what your seeing conditions are like as well. Generally, it's because it's never the same, right? It's generally you can look at how your guiding performs and how your stars are, what the HFR on your stars are, but that can be a challenge, especially if you're doing this from a small refractor. So maybe one thing that you can check out is to see what other people are using in your area, and if there are other people using 10-inch, 11-inch SATs, or even larger optics like 12-inch, scopes, and see how their images are looking. Make sure you're looking at someone who's experienced, right? So you're not looking at a beginner's data, someone that really knows their equipment well and knows how to process it well and take advantage of everything. And see how their data, if they're putting out really good quality data and they're in your area, then chances are your seeing conditions should be able to support it. Maybe reach out to people like that on Astrobin and ask them, what the seeing conditions are like and how often they're able to image. Because if your seeing conditions are mostly below average, then you're going to have a hard time with that SCT, and it's going to end up not getting used much. And you'll start second guessing yourself about whether or not the autofocus, you're doing something wrong on autofocusing, or if your processing isn't good enough, or if your mount's not guiding well enough, and it could all just be bad seeing that's causing your problems. Alright, so if you made it to the end, you've watched the whole video, then thank you very much. I do hope that you find this video useful. If you've already know this stuff and you're watching it anyway, then I hope I entertained you a little bit. Don't forget to give me a like on this video, and if you're new to this channel or you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Alright, with that, clear skies and good evening.